I'm Santanu and I'm a senior research fellow and professor of modern literature and culture. Welcome to my exp. It is often thought that the whole maritime tradition in literature ends with Conrad and Melville. And I realized while doing research that I don't think it's an end, it's the beginning of a very different kind of tradition which is inaugurated by Melville and Conrad, and it becomes also in many ways more global, because this is also the time, because of the introduction of steamship, that colonial intellectuals, colonial writers, they in turn are coming to Europe and they also start writing about their sea voyages and experiences. In The Mirror of the Sea, Conrad says that to a man of the sails, the sea is something which is not just a navigable element, but an intimate companion. The whole change or transition from sail to steam that we see across the 19th century completely changed or reconfigured these intimacies between the sea, the ship, and the sailor. Because on one hand, there's this technological shift, but that also intersected with certain meteorological changes as well as changes in the composition of the sailors. Because of the Navigation Act of 1849, it becomes much more diverse, it becomes much more multiracial. And then later on, later in the 19th century, we also have the unionization of labor, where the sailors become much more aware of their rights. And slowly, the distinction that we always had so far between the industrial worker on land and the sailor on sea, that starts blurring, because it's no longer the romance of navigation, but rather working as a stoker on ship. That's a fundamental crisis in the maritime world, and that's reflected in maritime literature. Because the whole sensuous experience of being on a sailing boat, that was very, very different from this new world of steam engine, with a different set of sound, a different rhythm, and it completely changes the idea of space and time. Before that, people were largely dependent on the direction and the gift of the wind, whereas now I know that if I leave Calcutta, I will reach Boston through a particular stretch of days. Particularly for Conrad, the change from sail to steam is a point of crisis in his life, as it was for sailors. And I think that pushes the entire maritime tradition in English literature in a completely different direction. And that's, I think, the first stage. And their work, it's full of these tensions between the old and the new, between the distinctions between industrial workers and these sailors. And then we move on to the next stage, and maybe, for want of a better word, the modernist stage. And we have people like Virginia Woolf writing her first novel, The Voyage Out, and then Malcolm Lowry, Ultramarine, James Hanley, Boy. And in all these novels, they explore some of the darker sides of gender, sexuality. Like, for example, in Voyage Out, this young girl, she gets sexually assaulted. In James Hanley, the boy gets raped repeatedly. But more recently, over the last, maybe I would say 20 to 30 years, we are seeing another wave, and that's often postcolonial writers like Fred Duaguerre or Amitabh Ghosh, writing about the sea and sea voyages. And it's interesting that we haven't had so long writing about the sea from these former colonies, It is as if they needed all this time, and often they go back to the past. So Amitabh Ghosh goes back to the opium trade, and in a way he is also re-establishing connections and showing the cosmopolitan world of the 18th century and before, or Fred Duaguerre, who's showing or examining the world of slavery. And I think they are very, very important in the absence of historical records. But it also shows a newfound confidence on part of these writers at this moment to go back to these difficult and often very painful histories. In conventional literature around the sea voyages, we are often this romance of navigation. But as we move into the 20th century, shipboard communities, they become almost little signposts or little communities where many of the landlocked debates around gender, sexuality, race, class, they get articulated most powerfully. There are a lot of myths about this homoerotic world of sailors, but very little is known about it. So as a result, we need again to go beyond conventional archives. And interestingly, during my research, I realized there's a lot of discussion around tattoos on soldiers' bodies. For example, I'd been looking at recruitment records in the National Archive at Washington, D.C., and there had been examples of tattoos shaped like a penis with sails on the soldier's body, or for example, words like pay as you enter. There's this huge world of tattoos, and I find this fascinating because in the absence of historical record of sexuality in the maritime world, they can tell us a bit more. Of course, it's speculative, but we are one step closer. Suddenly, out of nowhere, we almost have Herman Melville's extraordinary novella Billy Budd, written in the late 19th century, not finished, and discovered only after his death in a bread tin and published in 1924, the same year as A Passage to India. And it's a very complex story. You have Billy Budd, this extremely handsome and very innocent sailor, and then this very wise, tolerant, and supposedly enlightened captain, Captain Weir, and then this evil figure, Claggart, who has this vendetta against Billy and brings in a false accusation, and then Billy, in a fit of rage, ends up striking and killing Claggart, and then the law takes its course and Billy is hanged. So this is the story. What is extraordinary is that this charged homoeroticism can only be articulated through looks, little gestures, and the wonderful images and metaphors that Melville employs. It's there in Billy Budd, and there is always this relationship between sexual and naval transgression, transgression against hierarchy, transgression against sexual norms. But the story is like nothing we would find in the archives. And this is where I say that literature comes almost with an unearthly glow, but then it picks up all the traces and the hints and the suggestions that we have detected in the archive, but couldn't have ventured the whole story. And it all gets reconfigured in the imagination, and out comes something as remarkable as Billy Budd. The sea, from Homer's Odyssey or the Anglo-Saxon lyrics to the Romantic times, had been a source of wonder as well as of fear. It was a source of the sublime, whereas we have almost reached the end point now, whereas the sea is to many no longer just the sense of wonder, but one of precarity, that how do we save the sea?